In the last few lectures, we've been examining the contributions of Islamic civilization to the history of science. In the last lecture, rather regretfully I'm afraid, we had to deal with the decline of Islamic civilization. So this lecture represents a bit of a transitional period, a movement of our focus away from the Muslim world to the Christian world, a changing of the guard, as it were. In this lecture, we're going to look at the reawakening of the Latin West in the 12th century, a glorious time often referred to as the First Renaissance. Before I begin, though, I need to define what I mean by the term Latin West. By Latin West, I mean the part of the Western world where Latin was the major language spoken during the Middle Ages, namely the remnants of the old Roman Empire, the western half of the Roman Empire. This is to be distinguished from the Greek West, basically the eastern half of the old Roman Empire, in short, the Byzantine Empire, which, because of the expansion of Islam in the 7th century, was now restricted to Asia Minor, Greece and its archipelago, and the Balkans. But a third part of the West is the Arabic West. Now, this might strike some modern hearers as a bit of an oxymoron, but I don't think so. This is, in fact, something I want to stress, that the Arabic world is part of the West. Since the end of the Middle Ages, and particularly in our own times, there's been an attempt to separate the Arabic world from what we call the West. And this happens on both sides of the fence. Modern Westerners tend to view the Arabs and their culture as something other. Arabs themselves, at the present day, tend to distinguish themselves from the West as something other. But in my opinion, this is something that's not only completely wrong-headed, it's historically untenable. Let me be clear. Arabic civilization and Arabic culture are integral and essential parts of Western culture and civilization. Think about it for a moment. Latin, Greek, and Arabic cultures were all heir to the same classical traditions, the traditions of the classical period of Greece. Arabic culture inherited the riches of that classical tradition, and as we have seen, and as we shall see, it gave them back with the accumulated interest of original Arabic contributions to a Latin West that had lost or largely forgotten its patrimony. In religious terms, Christianity and Islam spring from a common Levantine root, and both of these great religions developed theologies that paired their individual revelations to the same intellectual, philosophical tradition of ancient Greece, the traditions to which they were both heir. So I think that if you take the culture and the contributions of the Arabs out of the picture, the whole history of the West fails to make sense anymore. Thus, when we think about the West, we should think about its three linguistic or cultural groups: the Greek, the Arabic, and the Latin. Accordingly, we began these lectures in the Greek world, moved on to the Greek Hellenistic world that set the foundations for the history of science. We continued with the Arabic world and its developments upon those Greek foundations, and now we have to turn to the rising Latin West, which has, in a certain sense, been the dominant part of the West ever since. There were a few attempts from the period about 600 to about 1000 to try and reorganize, to reignite Latin culture in Europe after the collapse of Roman civilization. But these tended to be largely local and short-lived. The first real attempt was by Charlemagne, who was crowned first king of the Franks, and then in 800, a king, or emperor rather, of the Holy Roman Empire. This did have some effects. In fact, for our story, the most important effect of Charlemagne was not just the political stability that he brought to medieval Europe for at least a very short period of time, but in particular an edict that he made that said that every cathedral and monastery must open a school. Now, in fact, Charlemagne listened to his own edict and opened a palace school in his palace at Aachen, imported the English scholar Alcuin of York, who was born in 735, died in 804, Alcuin of York brought in Anglo-Saxon teaching methods, helped run a school which was both for clerical people and for lay people. And in addition, he developed a new style of writing. We don't think often about writing and how important it is to scholarship. It's sort of something we take for granted. But the styles in which we write are very important. And Charlemagne's schools were a place where the Carolingian script, named after him, was devised. It was supposed to be easier to write, which it was, easier to read, which it was, and also was supposed to reproduce the way the ancient Romans actually wrote, which it didn't. They thought it did, but it didn't actually. Charlemagne's edict was partially urged on by his concern and the concern of many people that even the clergy were not particularly well educated at this point. So it took some time for this edict to take effect. It was a rather slow process because of the instability of Europe in this period, up until the 12th, or until the 11th century, certainly. And in fact, lasting changes began only in the 11th century, sparking what has been termed the Renaissance of the 12th century. Now, there are a lot of causes that have been put forward to explain what happened to spark this Renaissance of the 12th century. Let me just go through a few of them with you. One, which we can't deny, is that the barbarian raids declined in frequency quite dramatically in that century. It was the barbarian raids that had caused the gradual attrition and then collapse of the Roman Empire. These barbarian raids continued for centuries, the Vikings being sort of the last set of them, and this dwindled by the 10th, 11th centuries. So that allowed for the resumption of a stable coastal life and trade once again. Also, European population surged in the 1100s. Now, it's very difficult to actually calculate or to estimate what the population of Europe was in the Middle Ages. Nonetheless, scholars who have taken the leap and tried to figure out what the population was have suggested that the population of Europe doubled in that century. It may even have done as much as quadrupled in a very short period of time. Well, what does that mean? More people mean more urbanism. More urbanism, more division of labor. More division of labor, more leisure time. All of which mean more space for intellectual development. Now, it's unfortunate that leisure time doesn't necessarily translate into more intellectual development, but it is certainly a necessary prerequisite for it, even if it isn't a sufficient prerequisite for it. I should mention, by the way, an etymology that should be more widely known, and that is the etymology of the words school and scholar. It actually comes from the Greek word skole, which means leisure, because scholars are leisured people. Schools are places of leisure. It's better than going out driving the cattle in the field and plowing. It's better to be in a school which is a leisured atmosphere. My students do not believe that when I tell them. Nonetheless, it is true. School is a leisure activity. How was this larger population supported? Well, it's been suggested that there was a widespread climactic change in the period from about 1000 to 1200, in which the weather in Europe was warmer and wetter than usual. Now, there's some evidence that this is actually the case. This was the time in which the Norsemen were actually able to colonize Greenland. If you ever wonder about the name Greenland, if you see pictures of Greenland, it's not particularly green. It also allowed them to sail to the coasts of North America and set up colonies, probably in Labrador, Nova Scotia, some argue even as far south as Massachusetts. This, however, was short-lived. Those colonies died out. The Norse sagas tell us that about the year 1200, the voyage to these outer colonies became impossible because of what is described as walls of ice, presumably huge amounts of floating icebergs that had never been there before, at least in their memory. So there seems to have been a warm period in at least the climate of the North Atlantic in that period. Moreover, farming technology was enhanced greatly at about the same time. One of the most important pieces of technology was the invention of the horse collar. The old ways to harness horses for power was to put a sort of harness that had a bar across the chest of the horse, which meant as soon as the horse started pulling with all its weight, it would cut off its windpipe. So not a great way to get a horse to work harder. The invention of the horse collar allowed for the use of horse power. Speaking of power, water wheels started appearing for the purpose of milling in particular at about this time as well. Remember, the Romans, because of their slave culture, didn't worry at all about where to get power from. There were always cheap slaves. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't the case. And so water wheel technology, power technology, wind technology started developing much more. That, combined with crop rotation, which gave higher yields as well, meant more food, less work, more leisure time, more division of labor, and so forth. Well, whatever the relative importance of these constellation of causes, the effects of the Renaissance of the 12th century were dramatic. It was a time of broad-based cultural change across Europe in almost every field. The Gothic style of art develops at this time, and the age of the great cathedral building. In religion, reforms again occur. The Cluniac reforms, the Cistercian reforms date from this period. Changes also occur in language and literature. The vernaculars are used more in literature, in song, than Latin. Or I shouldn't say used more than Latin, used to an increasing extent that they had not known before. Similarly, in music, in law, in education, there were new reforms going on everywhere in the 12th century. So an enormously exciting time of change and development. Well, in the case of the history of science, the most important development of the 12th century was the initiation of a widespread translation movement. Now, we've already seen one translation movement. This is when Arabic culture availed itself of the riches of Greek and Persian learning. Now, the same sort of thing happens in Europe, except now the translations are from Arabic into Latin. The earliest translations seem to have been made in monasteries in the 10th century in a very likely place, northern Spain. There are manuscripts that exist now in Barcelona that came from the monastery of Santa Maria del Ripoll, which is in the foothills of the Pyrenees, which talk about the use of things like the astrolabe and Arabic mathematics. These texts are in Latin. So clearly, the people at this monastery had availed themselves of some of the Arabic learning that was in existence in Spain around them. One particular character that I should mention is Gerbert of Aurillac, who was born in 945, died in 1003. He was a teacher. We're going to talk about him more. But he did go to Spain and showed a particular interest for mathematics and astronomy. Learned how to use the astrolabe and probably introduced the astrolabe to Latin Europe. Also wrote a treatise on the abacus and on calculation. By the way, he was also elected pope. He was Pope Sylvester II. But these 10th century translations seem to have had very little impact, really. They weren't widely spread outside of Spain. It was only with the political and social stability of the 12th century that an extended exploration, appropriation, and assimilation of Arabic knowledge could occur. So the period of the Great Translation in the West out of Arabic is really from 1125 until about 1200. And as you can imagine, again, this happened predominantly in Spain. First of all, in the 11th century, Christian forces made rather substantial gains, incursions, depending upon your point of view, into the Islamic Empire, which increased awareness of Arabic learning. In the year 1085, Christian forces take over the city of Toledo. And so much of northern Spain is now taken away from the Islamic Empire and united with the Christian West. Cordoba and Seville are added to the Christian conquests later in the middle of the 13th century. Well, Spain provided the prime location for translations for three reasons. First, there was a settled Arabic culture. Sometimes we tend to think of the Muslim presence in Spain as an occupation. It's not. an occupation. It was settled Arabic culture. If we just look at Toledo, the city of Toledo was under Arabic rule for 375 years, nearly 4 centuries. Cordoba and Seville were under Arabic rule, Islamic rule, for 500 years. So you have to be consistent. Either there was settled Arabic culture in Spain that was then conquered by Christian forces, or we have to consider essentially all of the modern civilization in North America to be an occupation. Because remember, the Muslims were in Spain longer than Europeans have been in North America. The second factor which made Spain a prime location for translation was the presence of numerous Christian communities, which had always been there since the Muslim conquest. These Christians were known as Mozarabs, and these Mozarabs produced the first translations, many of the first translations. These native Spaniards, like John of Seville, he was born in the Muslim part of Spain, moved to the Christian north, and was involved in translation early on. Another was Hugh of Santalla, patronized by the Bishop of Tarazona in the Kingdom of Aragon. The third was the ease of travel to Spain. It's a great deal easier to cross the Pyrenees from France to get to Spain than it is to get on a boat and go to, let's say, Baghdad or to Cairo. Much easier to get to Spain. Now, what about these translators? Why were they doing this? Many of them note that their activity was aimed at curing what they called, or what one of them in particular called, the penuria Latinorum, the poverty of the Latins. That they recognized the riches of Arabic civilization, Arabic learning, Arabic libraries, and wanted to bring that into their native Latin culture. For example, when Robert of Ketton, an Englishman, translated the first treatise on alchemy into Latin in 1144, he writes in the preface, "This is because alchemy, what it is and what its goals are hitherto unknown to my Latin people." So here's a whole branch of knowledge that the Latins don't know about. Medieval Latins readily acknowledged, for a while at least, the superiority of Arabic intellectual culture. In fact, Arabic authorship of a text became more or less a mark, a guarantee of its quality. So much so that in the 12th and 13th century, there were various authors who were Latins, who probably didn't speak a word of Arabic, who tried to pass themselves off as Arabic authors by signing their texts with pseudo-Arabic names. Gave them authority, the authority of the Arabic world. Now, the most productive of the translators from Arabic, and there were a lot of them, was Gerard of Cremona, an Italian. He was born in 1114, died in 1187. Let me read to you a little bit about what his students wrote about him. This was written about 1190. They say of Gerard, "He had come to a knowledge of everything that was known to the Latins." Not bad. "And out of love for the Almagest, which he could by no means find among the Latins, he came to Toledo, and there, seeing the abundance of books in Arabic on every subject, and lamenting the poverty of the Latins, he learned Arabic in order to translate." Well, Gerard spent the rest of his life there in Toledo. He had students that came that learned how to translate as well and carried on his work. He translated over 70 books on astronomy, mathematics, physics, medicine, classical works, Arabic works, all kinds of things. He translated 6 books of Aristotle, the Physics, the Meteors, and other works, Euclid's Elements, the Algebra and Mathematics of Al-Khwarizmi. I should mention, just on a side note, it was hard for the Latins sometimes to transliterate Arabic names because there are a lot of sounds and letters in Arabic that don't have Latin equivalents. And Al-Khwarizmi turned into Algorizmi, which gives us the origin, since he was a mathematician, of the mathematical term algorithm. Algorithm really is a corruption of Al-Khwarizmi. He translated Al-Kindi on optics and on vision, Thabit ibn Qurra's very technical treatises on astronomy, 8 books of Galen on medicine, works on alchemy by Jabir ibn Hayyan, and by the pseudo Ar-Razi. So busy, busy man. Imagine this, we have floods and floods of people, of translators, coming from all parts of Europe, from England, from Italy, from Germany, from France, even from Slavic lands, to translate Arabic works into Latin. This great flood of scholars coming into Spain to do this. But Spain wasn't the only place. There was one other place I should mention, and that is Sicily. Because Sicily in the 12th century had a stable, multi-ethnic, and trilingual culture. This is because a kingdom had been set up there by the Normans. Norsemen, basically they had come from France, but originally from Scandinavia. They conquered Sicily from the Muslim rulers and set up a court in which the languages were Latin, Greek, and Arabic, and had a very multicultural, multi-ethnic atmosphere. For example, Roger of Sicily, one of the Norman kings of Sicily, invited Arabic scholars to come work at his court. The most famous of these is Al-Idrisi, a Moroccan by birth, who was a cartographer. And this is in the 12th century. And he there made maps for Roger, did researches on cartography and geography. One curious thing I should mention about Al-Idrisi's maps, because we still have some of them, he's the only person I know of that uniformly puts south at the top and north at the bottom. So all of his maps look like they're upside down to us. What I should say is that the multicultural, multi-ethnic atmosphere of 12th century Spain and Sicily resembles the early Islamic empire of the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, when Muslims were in a minority there. There were lots of Christians, Persians, Arabs, Muslims, Jews, Sabians all living together. So there's a close similarity between these two translation movements, that they occurred at the meeting place between cultures in multicultural environments that were settled and relatively stable. Now, in the 13th century, a second phase of the translation movement began, and attention turned from Spain and Sicily, from Arabic lands, eastward towards the Byzantine Empire. Why? Well, because the Latins had now gotten a taste of classical literature, and some thought, wouldn't it be better if rather than going the long way around through Arabic, we could get original Greek sources? In some senses, they were right about this concern. Translation was not always the high art that it could be. Many works passed through not just from Greek to Arabic to Latin, but some intermediate steps. Some of them went through Syriac before getting into Arabic. Some went through Spanish or Hebrew before getting into Latin. So the greatest translator here, sort of Gerard of Cremona's counterpart in the East, is Willem of Moerbeke, who was born about 1215, died in 1286. He was a Flemish Dominican. He lived a considerable part of his life in Greece, in fact. From 1278, he was the bishop of the Greek city of Corinth. Now, Willem had been encouraged, probably by a friend of his, you will have heard of, St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was very interested in Aristotle, very much appreciated Aristotle, rebuilt his theology around Aristotelian ideas, but he complained a great deal about the quality of the translations of Aristotle that he had that came out of the Arabic. There were many sentences that were incomprehensible to him. Now, that may have been partially a function of the translator. It may partially have been a function of Aristotle himself. Remember, Aristotle's works are lecture notes, not finished treatises, so probably some of each there. Well, Willem, in fact, in Greece, translated about 50 books. Those 50 books included essentially everything we have now of Aristotle. But he also translated other works. He translated everything he could find of Archimedes. In fact, when the first publication of the complete works of Archimedes was printed, this is after the invention of the printing press, this is in the early 16th century, so that's 300 years after the translating of Willem of Moerbeke, it was Willem's translations that were actually printed. So his translations had quite a long lifespan, so to speak. So now we have these two phases of the translation movement. One from the Arabic, taking place largely in Spain, somewhat in Sicily, very little actually in the Levant. There's only one person that I can think of, there are probably other less notable characters, that actually went to the Middle East to look for Arabic sources, and that was the Englishman Adelard of Bath. That was back in the 12th century. We'll talk a little bit more about Adelard of Bath in the next lecture because he's an important character for bringing in some Arabic learning early on. Now, let's take a couple of minutes to compare a little bit further the Latin translation movement with the earlier Arabic translation movement. I've already mentioned the similarity of multi-ethnic, multicultural societies that were stable. But the other thing to mention is what was translated. The Arabic writers early on, as well as the Latin translators later on, seemed to concentrate on three kinds of works predominantly: logic, mathematics, and natural philosophy. Quite interesting, important for the history of science. This is why the translation movement is of so much importance to us. But this particular interest in Aristotle's logic, Aristotle's natural philosophy, astronomy, astrology, alchemy, botany, what we would now call biology, mineralogy, was common to both of the translation movements. Now, there were some theological works that were translated. For example, as early as 1143, the Quran was translated into Latin by Robert of Ketton, the same one who translated the first alchemical text. He worked very closely with a very close friend of his, Herman the Dalmatian, man's best friend, who the two of them translated together a large number of works, most of them again Latin translations of Arabic scientific or mathematical works, but they also did the Quran. But there was essentially nothing literary that was translated in either translation movement. Now, this focus on natural philosophical topics, on mathematical topics, on logical topics, must imply that there was a demand for these very topics in the 12th and the 13th century. There was something that there was some place or some need that had to be filled by logical and natural philosophical works. Now, that means that we have to look at the destinations for these translations. We know they happened. We know who did them. We know when they did them. But what happened to this stuff? Did they just pack it up on mule and send it back over the Pyrenees? No, there was a reason. There was a cause for this. And that has to do with what I started this lecture with. That is the origin of schools through Charlemagne's edict. These schools developed as important centers of learning, gradually, actually fairly rapidly, replacing rural monastic centers as the focus of intellectual, scientific, natural philosophical, logical study. So, in our next lecture, we have to look at where these texts and ideas that were flooding into Europe went. The educational institutions which developed in Europe in the 12th and then the 13th centuries. In the 12th century, we'll see the places for teaching and scholarship were schools connected to cathedrals and monasteries, but these in turn gave rise to a peculiarly medieval institution, namely the university.